Guardian in London, argues that invading Iraq was bound to fail and that history should have taught America and Britain the Iraqis would not accept being occupied. This program, hosted by Politics and Prose Bookstore in Washington, D.C., is about an hour.
Well, thank you very much for coming. It's a great pleasure and honor to see so many people here. I've always liked coming to Washington. I lived here for 4 years in the 1970s when I was the correspondent for the same paper that I still work for, The Guardian. And it was particularly nice to come back this time and be greeted on Sunday when I arrived by this wonderful review in the Washington Post Book World, which perhaps some of you saw. I mean, if I'd been asked to review my own book, I don't think I could have done such a good job as... And there is, of course, a backstory about reviews. Often they're written by friends of the authors. So I hasten to say that Daniel Benjamin I've never met, knowingly at least, but I would be very honored to meet him, to thank him for this fantastic review. So if you'll allow me a little bit of self-indulgence, I will read one or two sentences from that review, because I think they do say what Barbara has also said. He says, "The tower of books that explain our misadventure in Babylon is sky high and growing. But Jonathan Steele has managed something that might have been deemed beyond reach. He's asked the question in a new and interesting way, could we have ever gotten this thing right?" Well, before I answer that question, I just want to briefly explain the title of this book. Although it has a picture of a rather dejected US soldier on the front, I'm not claiming, of course, that there's been a military defeat. There's no Waterloo involved here, there's no Dien Bien Phu. I think at best it's a military stalemate, and I don't think military victory is coming, but it's not really a military defeat. What I'm talking about is a political defeat on at least 4 fronts. A defeat for Bush, not for the American people, although you've had to pay the price of the defeat for Bush. The first one is the issue of Al-Qaeda. There was, of course, no Al-Qaeda in Iraq in 2003. So when the president on Wednesday, I think it was, claimed that a significant military victory was around the corner and Al-Qaeda was on the back foot, he conveniently didn't point out that Al-Qaeda was not only not on the back foot in 2003, it wasn't on any foot at all. There was no Al-Qaeda in Iraq in 2003. So that all that's happened is that the United States, by its invasion, has virtually invited Al-Qaeda to come in, because it's much easier to kill Americans in Iraq than to get to New York these days. And now, it is true, Al-Qaeda is somewhat on the defensive, but they needn't have been there at all if this occupation hadn't happened. So that's the first defeat for Bush, this idea that he went in there because of the front line of the war on terror. He's actually made it worse. Secondly, I think the US thought they were going in there to demonstrate overwhelming military power in the region, to send a message to all Iran's neighbors and to try and reduce Iran's influence. Well, it has actually been a demonstration of impotence. 4,000 young Americans have died, 30,000 have been wounded, and Iran's influence in Baghdad has never been as high in history as it is now. Interestingly, President Ahmadinejad made a visit to Baghdad about a month ago. It was announced in advance, unlike Vice President Cheney's visit or Senator McCain's visit, and he required somewhat less security than those other 2 gentlemen, showing, I think, pretty graphically that Iran is more tolerated by many people in Iraq than the United States. So that's another defeat for President Bush. Thirdly, I think he, and particularly the neocons, thought that they would establish in Iraq a liberal, secular, pro-Western regime which would be a model for the rest of the region. Well, no sane country in the Middle East wants to emulate the model of today's Iraq. And of course it isn't secular, it's religious. The people in charge are political Islamists. They're not particularly pro-Western, they are Shia religious groups, many of whom spent the exile years in Tehran. So again, a defeat for this neocon policy of trying to create this secular model. And finally, of course, Bush thought that he would, by toppling Saddam, enhance the strength, the feeling of solidarity and sympathy which most people around the world gave to the United States after the terrible events of 9/11. But in fact, all that's happened is that as a result of this occupation, the US image and reputation has taken a nosedive, not only in the Muslim world, but of course in Europe, Latin America, Asia, and virtually every continent. So that is why I'm calling it a defeat. It's a defeat for the Bush policy. But then why has it gone wrong? And could it ever have gone right? The conventional wisdom, which I'm challenging in this book, is well known. There are essentially two arguments. Argument number one is that the US went into Iraq without a plan. You hear this kind of argument constantly on the TV and a lot of the punditry in the newspaper columns and from politicians as well. Argument number two is that it then made a series of blunders. It dissolved the Iraqi National Army, it got rid of the Ba'ath Party, it failed to stop the looting of public buildings in Baghdad and elsewhere. Well, of course, these things were blunders. But if you just think about this argument for a second, it rests on an assumption. The assumption is that there could have been such a thing as a successful occupation. If only the Americans and the British had been more intelligent, more sensitive, more culturally aware, better managers, etc., etc., there could have been a successful occupation. Well, I think that this flies in the face of history, common sense, and the tradition of the Arab world, because the two countries that invaded were the countries that already had a century-long history of intervening. The British colonized Iraq in the 1920s. They imposed a Sunni monarchy. They put down with brutal repression the insurgency and the resistance that developed at that time. Then, of course, when the sort of British imperial power collapsed in the 1950s, and the US essentially sort of took up this imperial role, particularly in the Middle East, with constant interventions to topple regimes and prop up unpopular regimes in Lebanon, elsewhere, currently very strongly supporting Saudi Arabia, etc. Arabs were aware of that. People here may not have known that history. People in the White House may not have known that history, but Arabs were well aware of it, so they were bound to treat a new occupation with enormous skepticism. But there was this simplistic view here that if you toppled Saddam, who was indeed unpopular, very few Iraqis supported him, that you'd get a blank check just to stay there, rest on your laurels for having liberated the country. And they even argued that anybody who was against the invasion must be pro-Saddam. People who protested, marched in London and Paris and New York and so on, saying they were against the invasion before it happened, were demonized by the Bush administration as pro-Saddam. It was a completely false argument. As I found out particularly when I went to Amman, Barbara's already pointed that out. We went in advance of the invasion, and then we hoped to move in as soon as the first bombs fell. We thought that the Iraqi border guards on the Jordanian frontier would run away or disappear, and we'd all storm across the desert to Baghdad, and we'd get in there before the troops coming in from Kuwait. Well, I don't know whether the Pentagon had made some kind of private deal with the Iraqi border guards, telling them, you know, we're not going to bomb you, capture you, you stay there and keep the journalists out, or not. But they certainly didn't run away until the very last moment. So we were all penned up in Amman, getting increasingly frustrated. But it suddenly dawned on me that there was this fantastic resource right at our doorstep, Iraqis, that you could talk to. See, our colleagues who were in Baghdad really had very great difficulty in talking to Iraqis in a normal way, because you had to have a minder from the regime with you at all times, or a translator. And so any interviews you tried to do with Iraqis were obviously conditioned by that. They wouldn't really tell you what they believed. And in fact, it was hard to find anybody who was willing to be interviewed anyway. But here we were in Amman, and there were 300,000 Iraqi exiles on our doorstep. So I spent quite a bit of time interviewing people, and young, old, rich, poor, Sunni, Shia, religious, secular, students, artists, businessmen, all kinds of people, a whole range of society. And I tried to spend quite a long time with people individually. It wasn't sort of just asking them in the street, tick a box, do you want the invasion or not? I was sitting down in their flats, or they came to the hotel, or we were sitting in cafes and restaurants. And I found that people were very, very torn over whether they wanted this invasion or not, because nobody likes to be invaded, even if it's for an allegedly good purpose. There was one man who was a Sunni, who was a butcher, who'd left 5 years earlier and spent 5 years in Oman, and he sort of encapsulated this kind of dilemma. He said, I want the war to happen, I don't want the war to happen. I want Saddam to be toppled, I don't want my country to be invaded. He just couldn't decide. And then there was an art teacher I spoke to, an elderly man who was a Shia, who favoured the invasion. He used a rather graphic metaphor. He said the scorpion has to be stamped on, meaning Saddam, obviously. If it's not an Iraqi shoe, then let it be an American one. But then he went on to say that he was worried that the Americans might not leave quickly after having stamped on the scorpion. And this is what he said. The Iraqi people will rebuild their house the day after Saddam goes. If the US tries to meddle, we will fight them to the last breath. Iraqis hate Saddam, but they love their country more. And I think when we finally got into Baghdad, just after the statue came down, we found the same kind of attitudes repeated that I'd got in Amman. By then, of course, Saddam had been toppled. The statue had come down, and I went to see. I found a Shia to be my translator, and we went. He took me to the house of his brother, and he was a man in his early 30s. And as I'd always done with these other people in Amman, I didn't start off immediately with a question. I tried to understand a bit about where they came from and what their sort of life was. And he explained to me that he'd studied geology when he was a student. But when he graduated, he was geology of sort of oil. When he graduated, he suddenly realized that there was no private sector, obviously, in the oil area. You had to either work for the Ministry of Oil or for the State Oil Corporation. And he decided, on principle, he didn't want to work for that regime. So he just wasted the education he'd got and did sort of odd jobs and driving taxis and a little bit of small business enterprise and so on, just trying to make ends meet. So you would have thought, here's a man who must probably be very strongly for the liberation. First of all, he was a Shia. Secondly, he was obviously a man of principle. So I said, well, what do you think now? He said, Saddam betrayed us. I was completely taken aback. This didn't seem to fit at all. So I said, can you explain, what do you mean Saddam betrayed us? He said, he didn't organize any resistance to the fall of Baghdad. So there again you had it, this feeling of humiliation somehow, that other people had come in and toppled Saddam, and there were foreigners now in our streets, tanks and troops, and this was an affront to people's dignity, even though Saddam had been toppled. And then about 3 weeks after that, there was a big march of Shias to this town of Kabul, where there's one of the big shrines to the Imam Hussein, who was martyred many centuries ago. And they march and they sort of do this symbolic flagellation and so on. And about 1 million people were on the roads, coming either from north-west, from Baghdad, or from southeast, from the mainly Shia areas of Iraq. And under Saddam, of course, these processions, which were an annual affair, were not allowed to go down the main road. They had to go in minivans or take back roads, because obviously Saddam was nervous about huge crowds of people on the street who might sort of turn into an uprising in some way. So it was historic to see all these people on the street, and of course it was shown on Iraqi TV, and I think for many Iraqis this was much more the symbol of the new Iraq than the statue coming down, which we in the West saw. We thought that was the symbol. For them it was a million Shias on the march and this religious festival. This was much more the new Iraq, as of course it's proved to be, because we have a Shia Islamist government and have had ever since they had the first elections. But I talked to some of these people, and some of them were saying thank you. One man actually said, you know, praise God for George Bush. If he wants to become a Muslim, he will go to paradise. Other people said thank you and goodbye, and that was the more common attitude. So how could the British and the Americans have got this so wrong? Why weren't they? Why didn't they understand all this? Well, one thing was that they had the wrong template. They thought that it was going to be like Germany and Japan in 1945, which of course were successful occupations, which lasted many, many years, and of course there was no resistance of any kind, let alone any armed resistance. And Bremer, Jerry Bremer, you know, the first overlord of the occupation, in his book My Year in Iraq, which he wrote a year later, so this was 2 years after he went there, so he might have had a little bit of time to reflect by then, but he actually said in his book, my idea was that we should create a success here in Iraq that, like Germany and Japan, would last for 50 years. And many of the people who flew into Baghdad in those first planes to sort of take over the occupation, the Americans, were reading books about Germany and Japan. Very few of them were reading books about Iraq. It was quite extraordinary. But then you see they went into the green zone, and they had very little contact with Iraqis, except the ones who wanted to be nice to them because they wanted American money. There were all kinds of government officials who were going back to these ministries that were slowly reopening up. The salaries had to come from the United States. There was no real economy. So they're not the sort of people who are going to say to the Americans, go home. Similarly, the civil society that was now had a real opportunity to get going in this new Saddam-free country, they also wanted money from the United States. So the Americans, if they talked to Iraqis at all, spoke to a very selected and selective group of people. But I think we journalists had a much more easy time in talking to a range of Iraqis. In those days, until about the autumn of 2004, you could travel around Iraq with no fear of kidnapping. There was no danger at all. We drove around all over the place, stayed in small towns and so on. We talked to Iraqis of every walk of life, and I think we got a much better impression. And then, of course, there was this blank check idea, this false assumption that if you were pro-liberation, you would be pro-occupation. But I think it was this thank you and goodbye mood that was dominant. And in fact, the first opinion polls that were conducted in Iraq in 2003 showed this, because there was a poll done by a group which the State Department also used, a polling group, so it was considered respectable. And they asked people in October 2003, just go back to April in your mind and tell us, did you think it was a liberation then or an occupation? And 46% said we thought it was an occupation, and only 38% said we thought it was a liberation. And then they were asked, well, now it's October, it's 6 months later, what's your feeling now? And those who thought it was an occupation had gone up to 66%, and those who thought it was a liberation had dropped to 15%. So already in that first year, the vast majority of Iraqis felt it was an occupation. And increasingly we began to hear complaints. There were complaints about the obvious things, that the electricity wasn't back on again, the water supply wasn't back on, and in some ways I think the demands that Iraqis made were a bit unrealistic. But they felt that the US was a superpower, they'd toppled Saddam in 3 weeks, and so how come the electricity doesn't work? Well, of course there were more complicated reasons for that, but there was this sort of feeling of disappointment. You know, we thought our life would improve, and nothing's really changed. And people actually even began to make comparisons, saying, well, after the 1991 war, Saddam got the electricity going again in 3 months. I mean, I wasn't there at that time, so I don't know whether it was true, but there was quite a pervasive feeling that somehow Saddam had been more efficient than the Americans. But the most important thing was the political one, this question of occupation. And actually on the plinth where that statue had stood, in July 2004 we noticed a graffiti had emerged and it said, "All done, go home." We knew it was written by a graffiti, I think it must have been, by an Iraqi, because done was spelled D-O-N-N-E, it was misspelled. But he'd written it in English, obviously, so that the Americans and the British and others would be able to read it. And I remember going to Fallujah 3 weeks after this statue came down in April, at the end of April. And there was a very interesting little episode. We'd heard that something had happened the previous night, and 17, or a large number at that stage, we weren't sure of the exact number, of Iraqis had been killed by the Americans. So we went down there to find out what had happened. And it was the first big incident, I think, where quite a large number of people were killed. And we discovered that the town had basically liberated itself, because Fallujah is to the west of Baghdad. So the troops coming in from Kuwait had moved through southeastern Iraq and got to Baghdad and then stopped. And then some had gone north to Tikrit, Saddam's hometown, and Mosul. But they hadn't really gone west into the largely Sunni areas. But 3 weeks after the invasion, suddenly the 82nd Airborne Division did appear in Fallujah. And they set up a guard post, heavily armed sort of guard post on the roof of the building, right next to the mayor's office. Now by then, the old Ba'athist mayor had been thrown out, and the tribal elders and the sheikhs and the imams had chosen a new man to replace him. And the police were coming back into action. So there was already a new Fallujah, a non-Ba'athist new Fallujah there. The town had liberated itself. But the 82nd Airborne Division comes, sets up this guard post, they put up roadblocks, checkpoints, they demand people's identity, and they take over a local school for the troops to sleep in. And people were naturally rather annoyed. And the school was right opposite a row of houses. It was sort of middle-class suburb. And the troops were on the roof at night with these night vision goggles. And people wondered, you know, what are they looking at? And there were these impressions that somehow they could look through the curtains into bedrooms, and whether true or not, there was this sense that, you know, these people are overlooking us in a way that is unnecessary, and they're also occupying our school. So a protest march was organized, and it's not entirely clear what happened, but for some reason the Americans shot, and 17 people were killed. So we asked local people and the American commanders what happened. The Americans told us that somebody in the crowd had fired at the school, and they therefore were obliged to return answering fire. So I was there with a lot of other reporters. You know, let's find the evidence, the obvious thing. So we looked at the front of the school to find the bullet holes, you know. There weren't any. No bullet holes of any kind. So one had to assume that if somebody had indeed fired, they were firing into the air over the heads of above the school, and not at the school. And therefore, there didn't seem to be any legitimate reason why anybody would have to return fire. The troops weren't really under any threat, and certainly not fire to the extent that 17 people were killed, that there were vast holes in the masonry of all the houses opposite, the stones had come down, and so on. So I went up to the colonel, who was called Eric Nance, and asked him whether he'd ever thought of keeping the troops perhaps outside Fallujah, not in the town, in a school. And this is what he said. He said, no, I never actually considered that at all. If you want to help the Iraqis build themselves up, you have to be in there with them. We had no idea we weren't wanted. Well, I think he actually was reading me the epitaph of the whole occupation. We had no idea we weren't wanted. Because opinion poll after opinion poll has shown that Iraqis want this occupation to end and want the Americans and the British to leave. And that's been consistent all the time. And it wasn't just in the Sunni areas. It happened in the Shia areas too, because this went completely against the US assumptions. They thought because the Shia had been so brutally repressed by Saddam, they would undoubtedly welcome a liberation, which they did. But it didn't mean they wanted an occupation. They were just as much nationalist Iraqis as the Sunnis. So as long as the occupation was open-ended and no date was given for withdrawal, the Shia soon became suspicious. Bush, after all, had said mission accomplished on May the 3rd, 2003, and Iraqis said, well, yes, the mission is accomplished. Saddam's gone. There are no weapons of mass destruction. So why are you still here? There must be another agenda, some imperial agenda. They're here to take our oil, our resources. They're here to rule us. They want to use us as a kind of aircraft carrier for attacks on Iran or Syria or whatever it is. And so this suspicion was there in both communities. Secondly, the Bush people, I think, didn't realize that the political groups that would fill the vacuum after Saddam would not be these secular, English-speaking, pro-Western exiles like Ahmad Chalabi and Ayad Alawi, but they would be Islamists. They completely failed to realize that Islam had been growing in strength, political Islam, in the last decade of Saddam's rule, and would then emerge quite strongly after he was toppled. And of course, you can't be an Islamist and pro-Western at the same time. I mean, the very reason why so many Arabs turn to political Islam, whether it's the Muslim Brotherhood or Hamas in Palestine, is because they are fed up with the imposition, as they see it, of Western culture, Western norms, and Western troops on their soil. And so they feel Islam is the answer, is the alternative. And so you can't be an Islamist and welcome a Western occupation. So the American assumption that the Shia would welcome it was completely false. And the third point, I think, was that within the Shia community, there wasn't unity. There were at least 3 groups, still are, within the Shia community. And they would obviously compete, as any political groups do, for influence and authority, and try and do better than their rivals. Well, one of the terrains on which they were bound to compete was who is most anti-American, because that is the most popular thing to be. And that's why people like Muqtada al-Sadr created his Mahdi army, his Shia militia, and is probably the most popular Shia leader in Iraq, because he is the one who's most firmly against the occupation. The other ones are more ambiguous, at least in public. So that was another mistake. But then, of course, there's also the issue of counterinsurgency tactics, and I think I'll end on this so that we have some time for questions and discussion. The episode in Fallujah that I've described, I think, was in a way the spark that lit the whole insurgency. There was no need for that heavy-handed response that was taken by the US forces. And of course, it alienated hundreds of people. But it wasn't unique. In the remaining 3 weeks, rather, of April 2003, after the statue had come down, according to the Iraq Body Count, which is this very respected group that tries to tally the number of civilian casualties, and they have quite a conservative methodology. They check out reports, and there have to be at least 2 sources before they recognize it as legitimate. They calculated that 266 civilians were killed by the Americans in the 3 weeks of April 2003 after Saddam had been toppled. They were shot at roadblocks, they failed to see some sign to stop, maybe in the darkness or something, and were shot. Or like the Fallujah incident, there was some overreaction to perceived fire coming from Iraqis against the Americans. And in fact, this kind of heavy-handed insurgency, counterinsurgency, continued In the first 2 years of the occupation, up to March 2005, again according to Iraq body count, 2,654 unarmed Iraqis were killed by the occupation forces, including the British, but mostly by the Americans. Now, you have an image, and I had an image, that the main threat to Iraqis comes from car bombs and suicide attacks. And of course, there were some of those, and they were easily photographed because most of them happened in Baghdad. And so it was easy for us as reporters or cameramen, TV people, to rush out to these scenes of appalling carnage and see them for ourselves and then report on it. And of course that gave the impression that this was the main atrocity going on. But the figure that I've just given you, 2,654 dead Iraqi civilians in the first 2 years, is 4 times the number killed by suicide bombs and car bomb attacks in that same period. So despite the image, the Americans in the first 2 years of the occupation were actually killing 4 times as many civilians as Al-Qaeda or anybody else. Now that is not generally known, but you can look up the figures in the Iraq body count and you'll see that that is the case. Now after that, it is perfectly true, Al-Qaeda did start coming in a major way and deliberately tried to provoke sectarian conflict and civil war, and it's been unfortunately quite effective. And they went after Shia civilians and bombed Shia mosques and shrines, and then the Shia felt they had to take revenge, and they started killing Sunni imams and going after the Sunnis, and so we've had, over the last 3 years, this terrible tit-for-tat sectarian revenge killing. And Al-Qaeda has been largely responsible for that. But that was the second phase of the occupation. The first phase of the occupation, which sets the tone for everything afterwards, was what I've described. Well, I think I'll stop at this point so that we can have some discussion. But I think the point that Barbara emphasized at the beginning is the one that I make throughout the book. The thing was doomed from the start. The only way that the Americans could have left with some kind of dignity and honor would have been if, very soon after toppling Saddam, they'd announced that within, let's say, 6 to 9 months, we're leaving. We've done what we had to do. It's up to the Iraqis to choose their own government. We're not going to interfere anymore. We're leaving. Then I think maybe they could have got out with some dignity and honor. And if there'd been any question of security being necessary, and as I say, Al-Qaeda wasn't there at that time, the Baathists were disgraced and sort of virtually underground, so there wasn't really a security threat. But perhaps UN peacekeepers or Arab League people might have come in if necessary, if invited by a genuinely sovereign Iraqi government. But that wasn't to be. Of course, the neocons never wanted a short occupation. They always wanted a long one. And so, as I say, the occupation was doomed to defeat as soon as Bush decided to stay in Iraq, having toppled Saddam. Thank you.
Could you please comment on the implication of the Bush administration not attempting to enlist the early support or involvement of the United Nations?
Well, it was mainly because I think he was extremely angry with the United Nations for having tried to, well, in fact, successfully having refused to have a second resolution that would be a trigger for war. The first resolution was to get the inspectors in there, to give Saddam a last chance, and he did take it and bring in the inspectors. And then suddenly, well, inspectors had hardly begun their work. They'd been there about 6 weeks. The invasion happened, and there was no second resolution authorizing it, which made it therefore illegal under international law. So I don't think Bush was very well disposed towards the UN. But there was a debate on the 38th floor of the UN headquarters in New York about what the UN should do, because the idea was that they'd try and use the UN as a fig leaf to give cover for the occupation, so that there would be a UN resolution after the toppling of Saddam that would somehow authorize the occupation. And the UN, I've been told by people who were privy to these meetings, was very divided. Kofi Annan was wondering what should we do about it, and some of the people on his staff were saying, well, we've got to sort of patch it up with the United States now. We must show that the UN is still relevant, and we must get in there, even if it's a relatively minor role. And there were other people who were saying, no, it'll be the kiss of death if we get associated with this thing, and we shouldn't do it. But the ones who wanted to go in won out, and so the Americans and the British came forward with a resolution, which is 1483, which essentially authorises the occupation and gives the UN a minor role, subsidiary role. It's entitled to sort of facilitate, encourage, promote, help, but not to take any key decisions. And I think by then the countries, France, Germany and Russia, which had fought so hard to prevent the second resolution, had sort of lost their stomach in a way. I mean, it takes some courage to resist the United States, and I think they sort of collapsed. The French did make an effort to try and have a timetable written into for withdrawal written into 1483, but the other powers weren't keen on it, so it never was put into the final text. And so there is this resolution, and some people think that the murder of Sergio Vieira de Mello, who was the first UN representative who went in there when he was killed by a truck bomb attack on the UN headquarters in August, probably mounted by Al-Qaeda. Some people think it was because the UN was sort of identified with the occupation and therefore was seen by those who were against the occupation as a legitimate target.
I wonder if I could draw upon your considerable international experience to elaborate on a comparison for a broader, I think, conceptual point. In September 2004, you were in Moscow and you were reporting on the Beslan siege, and you met with Vladimir Putin in a kind of extraordinary meeting in September. He was going on about how international terrorists are behind Beslan. Is there a comparison to be made between Chechnya, Russia's attitude towards Chechnya, imperialism, the kind of folly or the myopia of great powers when it comes to nationalism, between that situation and what you're talking about in Iraq?
Well, there's certainly some comparisons, yes. I mean, Russia had its own war on terror before the American war on terror, and it's been distorted and manipulated in the same way that the war on terror here has been done. And Putin created anxiety about Chechen international terrorism and so on to justify his clampdown on the incipient Chechen independence movement. And so that's a clear comparison. I mean, the opposite point is that, of course, Chechnya was part of the Soviet Union. I don't think Iraq has ever been part of the United States. So there's a bit of a difference there. I'm not saying that gives Moscow more right to clamp down on the Chechens, because the Chechens have striven for independence for years, and of course it was incorporated against its will into the Russian Empire in the 19th century. But there is that comparison, and I think Putin is probably as ignorant of the mood among Chechens and the genuine desire for sovereignty as Bush is about the genuine Iraqi desire for sovereignty. So there is a comparison, yeah.
I'd like to ask you a question about how governments make decisions these days. Let's say you have the case of the United States and Iraq. There's virtually no debate, little debate in Congress. The media, I think, basically folds, as I think has been shown on a number of documentaries. The American people are kind of bludgeoned or frightened into compliance. And in many respects, there's almost an institutional collapse when dealing with this question. And at the end, you have probably a very small group of people who are making these kinds of decisions, almost like a kind of third world dictatorship. I mean, is that an overstatement? And if it isn't, did the same pattern repeat itself in England? I mean, how did Britain arrive at the same conclusion when they should have known better, given their history?
Well, I think you're absolutely right, and there is a big similarity, because the opposition party in Britain, the Conservative Party, supported the invasion of Iraq. It was put to a parliamentary vote, and they supported it, and therefore Blair had a huge majority. Similarly, the Democratic Party here pretty much gave Bush the authorization for the invasion too, so that it was a bipartisan war in both countries, unfortunately. And even now here, since the November 2006 congressional elections, which, as I understand, were fought largely on the issue of Iraq, and the Democrats won because of their perceived opposition, and then they don't seem to have followed through very effectively since then. I mean, I've actually written a slightly self-serving post on Huffington Post blog, which I think is going up today. Self-serving because I say the Democrats should use the defeat word, because I'm imagining a scenario that a Democratic president is elected this autumn and then fulfills his or her campaign promises and starts withdrawing troops from Iraq in about the first 6 months or so. The first combat troops begin to go. Then, of course, what will we see? We'll see the Republicans shouting defeat, defeatism. You're surrendering, you're quitting. We don't quit under fire, but you are. And they'll be using the D word against the Democrats. And, of course, it'll be pure political spin. But I think the Democrats should do a political preemptive strike now. And let's have hearings, you know, in the US Congress and the Senate on the reasons for defeat, the lessons of defeat, so that you nail it on the Republicans, or they nail it on the Republicans, the Democrats. And I think a sustained period of hearings where we get away from the sound bites that are characterizing the current political debate in this country about Iraq, with some real analysis of what went wrong, who told Bush what, why didn't they understand the political consequences of invading Iraq, why didn't they see what the forces were that would take over in the vacuum of Saddam, why didn't they understand that Islam was on the rise in the Sunni and the Shia communities, you know, who told Bush what the options were, did anybody look at the post-invasion options? I think that would be really important to get out on the table and get it out now, because you know, the fingerprints on this disaster are Bush's. They're not the Democrats, and I think the Democrats would do themselves a lot of good if they used the defeat word now. It would also help to unify the party, for one thing. I mean, they may not agree entirely on what to do next. Some Democrats want to pull out, some seem to support the stay the course line, some are for Obama, some are for Clinton, but at least there might be some party unity on looking at recent history and saying, you know, why did Bush and his Republican Party get it so wrong?
Just one final comment. A New Yorker magazine on Iraq, and the final line was, the people who had supported the invasion remained content and serene, and those who opposed it were in agony.
Very good comment.
So we're going to take, have we got 5 people, 6 people in line? 6. Okay, the 6 people who are in line.
Okay.
Then we'll shut down.
You said that if we had left a few months after we got in, we could have left with dignity. Can we leave with dignity? 6 months, in 6 months or so, like Senator Barack, I think, is working towards that aim. And also, by the same token, how did things go with the British retreating, you know, leaving in the South? Is that with dignity, with success, or is it just defeat?
I think it was defeat, although I understand, obviously, nobody likes to admit defeat, and so most of the commentators who've described us as defeat have been American. People like Anthony Cordesman from the CSIS and others and some other academic analysts have described that, just as I, as a British person, are now saying that the US has been defeated. It's much easier to talk about somebody else's defeat. But I think it is a fair characterization. But I mean, the one good thing that you can say about the British effort in Basra, it was that from about the mid 2004 onwards, the British realized that they could not influence any longer the internal debate among Iraqis, and that all we could do was provide some kind of security at the margin, but we couldn't intervene politically. And people, I remember in January 2005, I spent quite a bit of time in Basra just before the first election, talking to people, and I spoke to all the sort of Guardian reading type people. I mean, people one would assume if they were English would be Guardian reading, you know, the doctors, the architects, the lawyers, the engineers, and so on. They were all very disappointed. They were saying, why has Britain appointed this Islamist to be the governor of Basra? Because they thought, you know, one of their people would have done a better job, probably would have done, but the British had realized by then that the Islamists were so strong that it was much better to get on board with the majority. You'd have less trouble than if you tried to fight them. And so ever since then, and then the elections, of course, confirmed that. The nice Guardian-type people did very badly in the elections, and the various Islamist parties did rather well. So ever since then, the city's been in the hands of the Islamists, and the British have really had no way of influencing it. And the number of attacks actually has gone down since the British pulled out. There are now 4,000 of them at the Basra airport. They don't do anything anymore in the city, and it's actually become somewhat calmer, which I think is a hint that maybe if the US starts to withdraw, things may become calmer. Because after all, I mean, if the US announces an early withdrawal and Iraqis see that it's not a trick, that it's beginning to happen, the first troops are actually leaving, then Al-Qaeda loses all rationale for being there. I mean, it's already on the defensive, and because the Sunni Arabs have stood up against it and said, we don't like the way you're provoking civil war, we don't like these attacks on Shia civilians, you know, get out. You're foreign as much as the Americans. We've had one invasion from the Americans, we have another invasion from these jihadis from Saudi Arabia and Yemen, Algeria, etc. And of course, when the Americans do start going, then Al-Qaeda loses its rationale. So I think it would change the entire political dynamic inside Iraq if there was a clear announcement of an early US withdrawal.
One of the great strengths of the erstwhile Manchester Guardian, now the Guardian, is to still carry Doonesbury and Dilbert, although I think that a younger Winston Churchill might well want to throttle you. A great problem remains the difficulty of corruption and how to deal with that, the killer, the revenge killer. The stupidity of the administration was not to prepare for martial law. I have acquaintances who've gone to Baghdad and to try to help persons with medical managements, and were introduced to Iraqi Ba'athist physicians who cut out tongues and lopped off pieces of ears, because that's the way Saddam kept order unless somebody was actually executed. So now one of the questions I do have for you is, how do you maintain true stability, since people giving interviews to journalists who are from other countries run the risk of getting killed?
Well, you mentioned Winston Churchill. He gets a mention in my book, to show that his understanding of Iraq was about as good as President Bush's. When they were planning to install Faisal as the king of Iraq, he sent a request for guidance to one of his staff on the 14th of June 1921. He said, let me have a note in about 3 lines as to Faisal's religious character. Is he a Sunni with Shia sympathies? He spelled it S-H-A-I-H. He didn't get the spelling right. Is he a Sunni with Shia sympathies or Shia with Sunni sympathies? Or how does he square it? Which is the aristocratic high church and which is the low church? I always get mixed up between these two.
I suspect if everyone gets out, there'll be a bloody revolution which will make Iran's death squads look tame.
Well, I think, you know, it's a very, very important point. Will there be a terrible bloodbath when and if the Americans pull out. But I think the encouraging point one has to make is that this Shia versus Sunni stuff is unknown in modern Iraqi history. Of course, those divisions exist, but they've never been politically important, and they've certainly never reached this level of violence in the past. People often didn't know or care whether their neighbours were Sunni or Shia. People in college they were meeting, there was a lot of intermarriage, particularly among middle-class people in the cities, in the urban communities. So I think it's a cancer that's been artificially injected, largely by Al-Qaeda, but to some extent by clumsiness of the occupiers in trying to define people all the time as Sunni and Shia and raising this awareness of people's identity. But it's been going on for 3 or 4 years, and although there have been a terrible number of deaths, and there's a lot of bitterness and desire for revenge and resentment and suspicion and distrust and so on, I think it is reversible. It's not like Yugoslavia. Some people say, oh, well, of course, the Serbs and the Croats and the Albanians have been at each other's throats for years and so on, and as soon as the dictator Tito was removed, it was bound to sort of surface. Well, that's not actually the case in Iraq. These things are not, you can't use that analogy for Iraq. So, again, I think as soon as it's clear that the occupation is about to come to an end, I think there is a chance, I mean, I can't predict the future with certainty, of course, but I think there is a chance that Iraqis will look into the abyss, as it were, and say, we're now in charge of our own country, we're taking the sovereign decisions, and we don't want to go on with this Shia Sunni thing anymore, and we must patch the thing up. And so the forces of reintegration may dominate over the forces of separation. I mean, in the first year when these killings were beginning, it was remarkable how the leaders of the various communities, both the Sunni imams and the Shia religious leaders, kept saying, don't let us be provoked into sectarian tension. We don't want a civil war. It's outsiders who are doing this. So, in Yugoslavia, it was the politicians who created and manipulated and exploited these ethnic divisions. People like Milosevic and so on. They make great capital out of it. But in Iraq, in the last 3 years, it's been the opposite, at least initially. The leadership and the politicians were saying, no, keep calm, don't allow yourselves to be provoked. We want unity. We're all Muslims. Doesn't matter whether it's Sunni or Shia. So I think, as I say, it is a cancer and it may spread, but I think it's still early enough, it's been detected enough that it could be cured and reversed.
I ask this not to be nasty, but to what extent was Blair's support of Bush payback to the United States support of the worldwide unpopular attitude of Britain in the Falklands, and secondly, of course, the support of Margaret Thatcher turning him around, his father around, into the first invasion of Iraq, and secondly, the propaganda which is being kind of planned for us now in the future is two things, and I want your comment on it. The first is that this surge is a wonderful thing, and if we hold on, we've got it all won, whatever that means. And the second thing is that if we leave, the defeat means Iran is going to move in.
Well, there are about 3 points there. I'll try and remember them. The Falklands thing I don't think is particularly relevant. It was so long ago. But I think Blair had the idea that Britain must stand close to the United States when the issues of war and peace are on the table. It's in our strategic interest to be linked to the United States, and it sort of separates us from the continent of Europe. And Blair had this idea that Britain could somehow be a bridge between the United States and the rest of Europe. I think it's a laughable concept, really, because France and Germany have perfectly good relations with Washington. They don't need sort of an interpreter in Blair to sort of speak for them in Washington and vice versa. So it was fairly ludicrous, but that is how he saw it. I mean, not all British prime ministers have done that. You know, when Lyndon Johnson asked Britain to send troops to Vietnam in 1965, Harold Wilson, who was the prime minister, also a Labour Party person, by the way, refused to do it. It took some courage, but he knew it was very unpopular in Britain, and he preferred to side with British opinion rather than with Lyndon Johnson. So that was one thing. But I think the other reason was that Blair has this very moralistic attitude to things. He's just about to become Professor of Divinity at Yale. I don't know if you saw that. He's taking up a position in Yale to give lectures on morality and leadership. It was announced about a week ago. I'm not joking. And there was one occasion when he did actually invite some academics to come in, the only outside experts he consulted before the invasion. And 6 people were invited. 3 of them were experts on Iraq and written histories of Iraq and so on. 3 others were general experts on security in the Middle East. And one of them, I mean, I spoke to them in preparing for this book. And one of them, George Joffe from Cambridge, when he'd had given his little presentation, he said, this is a very, very complicated country. There are all kinds of sort of intercommunal issues and potential conflicts, and don't imagine that you're going to be welcomed. And Blair's comment was, but Saddam's uniquely evil, isn't he? I mean, he wasn't interested in the political context. It was just, good and evil, this, the scorpion had to be stamped on, and that was all. It was very, very simple sort of attitude, and I suppose to some extent Bush is the same thing. This sort of, if you're not with us, you're against us, and so on. This is a great moral cause. Finally, your point about Iran. Yes, Iran's influence is much better in Iraq than it's ever been in history. And Iran is probably paying and arming all of the 3 different Shia factions that I've mentioned. It's putting its bet on all 3 horses, not sure which one is going to win, and make sure that whoever it is, it's somebody who's linked to Iran. But, I mean, these client-master relationships are always very complicated. Just because you pay somebody doesn't always mean that they will do what you want. I mean, there's a history of the world is littered with clients who turn against their master. And so it's not absolutely clear that if the Americans withdraw, Iran will really be able to sort of pull strings and get things done in Baghdad. But I think that certainly the idea that Iran would invade Iraq is pretty ludicrous. I mean, if you've got a Shia Islamist regime in Baghdad, unless it's threatened by the Sunnis with some sort of armed insurrection, why should Iran bother to invade? It makes no sense.
We were brought up on embedded journalists, and you are not one, and it struck me when you said that you were wandering around quite a bit, quite freely. Would you comment on how much secular freedom, poetry, literature, and other aspects of daily life you saw during that wandering about, and how soon do you think secularism can come back to Iraq?
Okay, well, just first of all, I mean, you don't have to be embedded all the time. You can get out of bed, although the technical phrase is disembedded. So I was at one time embedded with the British, and then I disembedded. I got a bit fed up with being minded by them all the time. But so, I mean, I think most journalists, including American journalists, spend some time. During the war, you had to be either embedded or not. Obviously, you couldn't sort of change halfway through the war. But once the war was over, I mean, the toppling of Saddam, you could do whatever you want. So people sort of spend a week with the Marines, and then they go back to normal reporting in Baghdad. So it's not as though you make some sort of fundamental life choice to be embedded or not. But the point about the arts and so on, yes, no, the National Theatre was very near where we were living in Baghdad. We had for a time a house, but then we had to give it up because of the fear of kidnapping. And the whole thing was sort of coming to life, and the artists were re-emerging, and there's a very famous street where poets used to congregate, and it's a street of books, really, hundreds of bookshops all along one street. And it was unfortunately destroyed a few months ago in a bomb attack. The cafe is just now in rubble, and there are about 3 bookshops left when there used to be 30. No, there was a great flowering of the arts in the first year or so, but then security made it very difficult, and people just didn't want to go out in the evening. The city virtually closes at 5 o'clock as soon as it starts to get a little bit dark. There is an official curfew that starts much later in the evening, but there's a sort of unofficial curfew at dusk. People are just too frightened.
Yes, I think I basically agree with what I think you're saying, which is we should be getting out, and we should be getting out as soon as possible. My one question that I'm left with is this: what do we do if one of the previous questioners is right, and the level of violence escalates sharply once we start to pull out? How can we keep our leaders from using this as an excuse just to jump back in and keep the quagmire going?
Well, I think you say that this is outsiders can't intervene in a civil war. You can't really play a useful role. And as I've hinted, the British in Basra can't do it, and I think increasingly the US is unable to do it in Baghdad. I mean, the very fact that Bush is constantly telling the Prime Minister, Nouri al-Maliki, to do this, do that, do the other thing, here are the benchmarks, tick them off, why aren't you behaving properly? And Maliki doesn't listen. Shows that the US is actually losing political influence all the time. It's becoming increasingly irrelevant, except in this very narrow tactical military sense of small things like doing a bit more patrolling in Baghdad, now that the city's already become a series of ghettos.
My question deals with you carrying us into the future. After the majority of American troops have withdrawn, will the Civil War continue? Will Iraq become a federation? Or will it separate in 3 separate states? Or is there something else?
No, well, I think I've already said that I think because this Sunni-Shia tension is of relatively recent origin in the last 3 or 4 years, it can be reversed, and so I don't think it's inevitable that it's going to get worse. I think it's more likely to get better, as I say, when Iraqis realize they're in charge now. And I think the religious leaderships on both sides hopefully will encourage the communities to be calm and not to take revenge, just as they were saying that in 2005. Partition, I think, is not on the agenda. I mean, the Shia don't want partition. At least the majority of Shia don't, because why would they want to give up? They are the dominant group now because of their demographic. Majority is roughly 60% of the population is Shia, so why would they suddenly sort of hand out a bit of their country for nothing? I mean, only again, as I said before, if there's some existential threat coming from the Sunnis that the Shia feel they cannot handle, then they might say, well, let these people go off on their own. But the Sunnis don't want to go independent, because, well, why would the Sunnis, if you had some little Sunnistan, what would it be? It would be landlocked. It would have no oil. It would have very little arable land except along the valley of the Euphrates. Why would Sunnis, again, unless they felt in some total existential threat, want to become independent in that sense? The Kurds, yes, that's a different matter. I mean, they are ethnically different from Arabs. They have a different language. They have always wanted their own state, and not just the Kurds of Iraq, but the Kurds of Iran, Syria, Turkey, etc. So that's another issue. But and I think there's potential for some violence there, but over places like Kirkuk, which is not in the present region of the Kurdish autonomous area, but the Kurds want to get hold of. And they're not going to go for independence now, because that would mean abandoning their chance of getting Kirkuk. So for the moment the Kurds have it both ways. They have almost total independence. They don't even fly the Iraqi national flag over public buildings in Kurdistan. And they also have a foot in the Baghdad door, so they have it both ways. Thank you.
Okay,
Jonathan Steele is a senior correspondent and columnist for The Guardian in London. His books include The South African Connection, Socialism with a German Face, and The Limits of Soviet Power.
Not for the American people, although you've had to pay the price of the defeat for Bush. The first one is the issue of Al-Qaeda. There was, of course, no Al-Qaeda in Iraq in 2003. So when the president on Wednesday, I think it was, claimed that a significant military victory was around the corner and Al-Qaeda was on the back foot, he conveniently didn't point out that Al-Qaeda was not only not on the back foot in 2003, it wasn't on any foot at all. There was no Al-Qaeda in Iraq in 2003. So that all that's happened is that the United States, by its invasion, has virtually invited Al-Qaeda to come in, because it's much easier to kill Americans in Iraq than to get to New York these days. And now it is true Al-Qaeda is somewhat on the defensive, but they needn't have been there at all if this occupation hadn't happened. So that's the first defeat for Bush, this idea that he went in there because of the front line of the war on terror. He's actually made it worse. Secondly, I think the US thought they were going in there to demonstrate overwhelming military power in the region, to send a message to all Iran's neighbors and to try and reduce Iran's influence. Well, it has actually been a demonstration of impotence. 4,000 young Americans have died, 30,000 have been wounded, and Iran's influence in Baghdad has never been as high in history as it is now. Interestingly, President Ahmadinejad made a visit to Baghdad about a month ago. It was announced in advance, unlike Vice President Cheney's visit or Senator McCain's visit, and he required somewhat less security than those other two gentlemen, showing, I think, pretty graphically that Iran is more tolerated by many people in Iraq than the United States. So that's another defeat for President Bush. Thirdly, I think he, and particularly the neocons, thought that they would establish in Iraq a liberal, secular, pro-Western regime which would be a model for the rest of the region. Well, no sane country in the Middle East wants to emulate the model of today's Iraq. And of course it isn't secular, it's religious. The people in charge are political Islamists. They're not particularly pro-Western. They are Shia religious groups, many of whom spent the exile years in Tehran. So again, a defeat for this neocon policy of trying to create this secular model. And finally, of course, Bush thought that he would, by toppling Saddam, enhance the strength, the feeling of solidarity and sympathy which most people around the world gave to the United States after the terrible events of 9/11. But in fact, all that's happened is that as a result of this occupation, the US image and reputation has taken a nosedive, not only in the Muslim world, but of course in Europe, Latin America, Asia, and virtually every continent. So that is why I'm calling it a defeat. It's a defeat for the Bush policy. But then why has it gone wrong? And could it ever have gone right? The conventional wisdom, which I'm challenging in this book, is well known. There are essentially two arguments. Argument number one is that the US went into Iraq without a plan. You hear this kind of argument constantly on the TV and a lot of the punditry in the newspaper columns and from politicians as well. Argument number two is that it then made a series of blunders. It dissolved the Iraqi National Army, it got rid of the Ba'ath Party, it failed to stop the looting of public buildings in Baghdad and elsewhere. Well, of course, these things were blunders. But if you just think about this argument for a second, it rests on an assumption. The assumption is that there could have been such a thing as a successful occupation. If only the
Guardian in London argues that invading Iraq was bound to fail, and that history should have taught America and Britain the Iraqis would not accept being occupied. This program, hosted by Politics and Prose Bookstore in Washington, D.C., is about an hour.
Well, thank you very much for coming. It's a great pleasure and honor to see so many people here. I've always liked coming to Washington. I lived here for 4 years in the 1970s when I was the correspondent for the same paper that I still work for, The Guardian. And it was particularly nice to come back this time and be greeted on Sunday when I arrived by this wonderful review in the Washington Post Book World, which perhaps some of you saw. I mean, if I'd been asked to review my own book, I don't think I could have done such a good job as And there is, of course, a backstory about reviews. Often they're written by friends of the authors. So I hasten to say that Daniel Benjamin I've never met, knowingly at least, but I would be very honoured to meet him, to thank him for this fantastic review. So if you'll allow me a little bit of self-indulgence, I will read one or two sentences from that review, because I think they do say what Barbara has also said. He says, "The tower of books that explain our misadventure in Babylon is sky high and growing. But Jonathan Steele has managed something that might have been deemed beyond reach. He's asked the question in a new and interesting way, could we have ever gotten this thing right?" Well, before I answer that question, I just want to briefly explain the title of this book. Although it has a picture of a rather dejected US soldier on the front, I'm not claiming, of course, that there's been a military defeat. There's no Waterloo involved here, there's no Dien Bien Phu. I think at best it's a military stalemate, and I don't think military victory is coming, but it's not really a military defeat. What I'm talking about is a political defeat on at least 4 fronts. A defeat for Bush. Fell. We thought that the Iraqi border guards on the Jordanian frontier would run away or disappear, and we'd all storm across the desert to Baghdad, and we'd get in there before the troops coming in from Kuwait. Well, I don't know whether the Pentagon had made some kind of private deal with the Iraqi border guards, telling them, you know, we're not going to bomb you, capture you, you stay there and keep the journalists out, or not. But they certainly didn't run away until the very last moment. So we were all penned up in Amman, getting increasingly frustrated. But it suddenly dawned on me that there was this fantastic resource right at our doorstep, Iraqis, that you could talk to. See, our colleagues who were in Baghdad really had very great difficulty in talking to Iraqis in a normal way, because you had to have a minder from the regime with you at all times, or a translator. And so any interviews you tried to do with Iraqis were obviously conditioned by that. They wouldn't really tell you what they believed. And in fact, it was hard to find anybody who was willing to be interviewed anyway. But here we were in Amman, and there were 300,000 Iraqi exiles on our doorstep. So I spent quite a bit of time interviewing people, and young, old, rich, poor, Sunni, Shia, religious, secular, students, artists, businessmen, all kinds of people, a whole range of society. And I tried to spend quite a long time with people individually. It wasn't sort of just asking them in the street, tick a box, do you want the invasion or not? I was sitting down in their flats, or they came to the hotel, or we were sitting in cafes and restaurants. And I found that people were very, very torn over whether they wanted this invasion or not, because nobody likes to be invaded, even if it's for an allegedly good purpose. There was one man who was a Sunni, who was a butcher, who'd left 5 years earlier, spent 5 years in Amman, and he sort of encapsulated this kind of dilemma. He said, I want the war to happen. The Americans and the British should have been more intelligent, more sensitive, more culturally aware, better managers, etc., etc. There could have been a successful occupation. Well, I think that this flies in the face of history, common sense, and the tradition of the Arab world, because the 2 countries that invaded were the countries that already had a century-long history of intervening. The British colonized Iraq in the 1920s. They imposed a Sunni monarchy. They put down with brutal repression the insurgency and the resistance that developed at that time. Then, of course, when the sort of British imperial power collapsed in the 1950s, and the US essentially sort of took up this imperial role, particularly in the Middle East, with constant interventions to topple regimes and prop up unpopular regimes in Lebanon, elsewhere, currently very strongly supporting Saudi Arabia, etc. Arabs were aware of that. People here may not have known that history. People in the White House may not have known that history, but Arabs were well aware of it, so they were bound to treat a new occupation with enormous skepticism. But there was this simplistic view here that if you toppled Saddam, who was indeed unpopular, very few Iraqis supported him, that you'd get a blank check just to stay there, rest on your laurels for having liberated the country. And they even argued that anybody who was against the invasion must be pro-Saddam. People who protested marched in London and Paris and New York and so on, saying they were against the invasion before it happened, were demonized by the Bush administration as pro-Saddam. It was a completely false argument. As I found out particularly when I went to Amman, Barbara's already pointed that out. We went in advance of the invasion, and then we hoped to move in as soon as the first